She was a grad student at
Hi everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's installment of our department's Friday Colloquium series. I'm Rebecca Wisnett, chair of the philosophy department, and we're pleased and honored to welcome this afternoon's speaker, Dr. Gaile Pohlhaus, Jr. Dr. Pohlhaus is professor of philosophy at Miami University, just down the road, where she arrived in 2006 after receiving her PhD at Stony Brook. She describes her research as focusing especially on questions of knowledge and identity in light of differences in social position, noting that her work draws on feminist and critical race theorists, both analytic and continental. Dr. Pohlhaus has an extensive publication record, having co-edited the Routledge Handbook of Epistemic Injustice, as well as a forthcoming special issue of the journal Hypatia on the topic of intersectional epistemologies. She's authored upwards of 20 peer-reviewed articles and chapters. A few whose titles make me especially want to read them are Teaching Philosophical Reading and Writing by Making Invisible Disciplinary Practices Visible, Gaslighting and Echoing, or Why Collective Epistemic Resistance is Not a Witch Hunt, and Different Voices, Perfect Storms, and Asking Grandma What She Thinks, Situating Experimental Philosophy in Relation to Feminist Philosophy. One fun thing that I learned from Dr. Pohlhaus' CV is that in addition to serving as a member of the Committee on Committees, she has also taught a course called Thinking About Thinking. So I want to take that course. Not sure I want to serve on the Committee on Committees, but her talk today is entitled An Epistemology of the Oppressed, Resisting and Flourishing Under Epistemic Oppression. So she's going to speak for about 40-45 minutes. We'll then have some discussion, Q&A, and then you're encouraged to hang out for more conversation, some refreshments, which you can actually get now or anytime if you need sustenance. So yeah, with that, I'll welcome Dr. Pohlhaus.
I want to thank the philosophy department for inviting me, and especially Rebecca and Rita for getting me here and giving me directions and doing all the kind of behind-the-scenes logistical stuff. Two kind of funny things that I thought I would mention. You noticed the junior. My mother was also a professor, although she was a professor of religious studies. And she actually gave a talk at the University of Dayton many years ago, I believe when the College Theology Society was here. And then the second thing that's like, oh, Dayton, is that the kind of inspiration for this talk comes from an essay by Tommy Shelby. And I saw him deliver an early version of this talk here at Dayton. When Peggy DeSalis had a conference, I think it was on coalition across difference, and Tommy was one of the keynotes. And this talk really struck me, so that when it became published, I was like, I'm finding that talk. And yeah, and it's been with me for a long time. I won't say how long, because I looked it up and I was like, oh, that was a long time ago. So I'm really happy to be here and share this work with you. So in the Ethics of Uncle Tom's Children, Tommy Shelby considers the question, how should one live under conditions of oppression? This question, he notes, is one of non-ideal theory. In other words, if the work of ideal theory is to imagine the ideal outside or above our current world in order to provide standards to strive toward, then non-ideal theory asks, what questions grow out of the world as it is that we might consider, and what concepts might we develop in response to those questions that could help us to navigate the world as it is? However, the manner in which Shelby asks this question is non-ideal in two senses, and this is what really struck me. First, it is non-ideal in the sense of thinking about ethical life under real-world non-ideal conditions. What does living ethically look like when the world is unjust? And second, it is non-ideal in a second sense that Shelby is explicitly thinking about the ethical lives of and from the perspective of a particular subset of humanity, those who are oppressed. So how ought those who are systematically subject to injustice live? In other words, he is not developing a universal standard for all humans living in a non-ideal world, but rather asking what issues and what forms of living arise from a particular set of situations in that non-ideal world. For what it's worth, theory that only explicitly addresses the first implicitly makes choices about the second, insofar as it imagines a generic actor who is not subject to systematic injustice, and that is also a particular set of situations within the world. It's just not made explicit, I think. So I appreciate Shelby's explicitly making a point of specifying from where he is asking the question, how ought I to live? In doing so, he notes two avenues of consideration. First, whether certain imperatives to resist arise for the oppressed, and second, what it would mean for those who are oppressed to sustain a good life despite injustice. Both questions are fraught and interconnected. To the extent that one might say, I am obliged to resist my own oppression, I may commit myself to a joyless, unsustainable life. But to the extent that I might try to develop a good, decent life despite oppression, I may appear or be tempted to avoid direct resistance to oppression. These two avenues are not necessarily in tension, insofar as resistance itself is an exercise of agency, and thus a way of flourishing. Moreover, flourishing to any extent under oppression can be seen as a kind of resistance, insofar as systems of oppression seek to extract all labor, resources, and energy away from the oppressed. What strikes me as particularly important in Shelby's essay, however, is that these questions and considerations are not addressed to oppressors, but rather they are in conversation with those who are subject to oppression. Today I want to ask Shelby's question in both of its non-ideal senses within an epistemic context. In other words, in thinking through an epistemology of the oppressed, I want to consider epistemic life from and with the perspectives of those who are systematically subject to unjust infringements on their epistemic agency. Now, despite a growing amount of literature on epistemic injustice, it strikes me that much of this literature does not yet fully contribute to an epistemology of the oppressed, but is instead oriented around an epistemology of how oppressors commit injustices, why oppressors should stop committing injustices, and or how oppressors could be better knowers or better people. So I want to provide an example to illustrate what I mean. Started? Yeah, I'll flip to this beautiful picture. So one of the things that Jennifer Lisa Vest taught me was that when you're giving a talk, it's good to like hit multiple sides of the brain so that you can keep focusing. So we have this lovely, hopefully it's stimulating your brain in different ways than my words can. In her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall-Kimmerer, who is now a scientist, decorated professor, and enrolled member of the citizen Potawatomi Nation, describes meeting her advisor during her first year of college with the following. So this is a very long quote, but I think it gets across a lot. Quote, "There were hardly any women at the forestry school in those days, and certainly none who looked like me. The advisor peered at me over his glasses and said, 'So, why do you want to major in botany?' His pencil was poised over the registrar's form. How could I answer? How could I tell him that I was born a botanist, that I had shoeboxes of seeds and piles of pressed leaves under my bed, that I'd stop my bike along the road to identify a new species, that plants colored my dreams, and that plants had chosen me? So I told him the truth. I was proud of my well-planned answer, its freshman sophistication apparent to anyone, the way it showed that I already knew some plants and their habitats, that I had thought deeply about their nature and was clearly well prepared for college work. I told him that I chose botany because I wanted to learn about why asters and goldenrod looked so beautiful together. I'm sure I was smiling then in my red plaid shirt, but he was not. He laid down his pencil as if there was no need to record what I had just said. "Miss Wall," he said, fixing me with a disappointed smile, "I must tell you that that is not science. That is not at all the sort of thing with which botanists concern themselves." End quote. So under the standard terminology within the epistemic and justice literature, we might say that the advisor here is viewing his student as less competent because of who she is. Note that the problem here isn't one about testimony transfer per se. Like, so it's not that he doesn't believe her, for sure, he believes what she's saying. He just doesn't see the relevance of it, right? So the wrong concerns failing to interact with the student as someone who has something of epistemic worth to bring to the situation. That the advisor harbors wrongful prejudices about his student's competence is certainly suggested, not only from the manner with which he interacts with her in this particular moment, but also by the fact that later, in writing his recommendation letter for her, for grad school, he would write that, quote, "She's done remarkably well for an Indian girl," end quote. In addition, however, there does seem to be a lack of understanding going on, which might make us think, oh, maybe there's a kind of meaning-making injustice or hermeneutical injustice, as it would be called in the literature. But to call the wrong a hermeneutical injustice would be to say that the language and tools available for expressing what the student wanted to express was not available, so she was having trouble knowing something. This is clearly wrong. Kimmerer did know. It was the advisor who had trouble understanding how the kind of motivation she was expressing fit within his understanding of botany and science. So the wrong here seems to be closer to what I've called hermeneutical ignorance, where a marginally situated knower does have resources to understand their own experience, but the dominantly situated knower is not competent in those resources, and furthermore does not take those resources seriously so that they can continue ignoring what those resources are designed to show. So already we begin to see some problems, like it's not really what the literature would call testimonial justice, not really what it would call hermeneutical injustice, but I want to take it a step further than that. For even if we tweak the definitions or develop the terms available in the epistemic and justice literature, I think the perspective on these injustices is still limited to identifying what the advisor is doing wrong and helping the advisor know how to do things better, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not at all helping the student. So pointing out testimonial injustice tells the advisor he ought to take his student more seriously. Pointing out a kind of meaning-making injustice tells the advisor he might be lacking tools to fully understand and appreciate what she's saying. And while both of these observations might assure the student that she is in fact being wronged, none of them really suggest what she might do about that, how she might resist it, or at the very least, protect herself from the harm to her in the interaction. Now, of course, Kimmerer herself is already showing us something about how to do that, insofar as she is providing resources for her former self as she recounts this story, noting that her response was well planned, with a freshman's sophistication apparent to anyone. And this strikes me, like she says, my sophistication was apparent to anyone. And then she goes on to say that the advisor was like, no. So there's an interesting tension there, where she's both holding the wrong, but also attending to herself in recounting it. Affirming that her answer demonstrated that she already knew some plants and their habitats, that she had thought deeply about their nature, and was, in fact, clearly prepared for college work. I think Kimmerer's description of her relation to the plants also matters here, that they colored her dreams, and that the plants had chosen her. I've arranged the words around the image of asters and goldenrod because I like to think of what Kimmerer is doing here as building an epistemic shelter within a hostile environment, one that provides nourishing sense not only to herself as a knower, but to her relationship with the world that she knows. There is nothing in the epistemic injustice literature that shows us this, or attends to these particular aspects of the situation. To the extent that the epistemic injustice literature remains focused on identifying the wrongness of epistemic injustices and how to avoid committing them, it remains dangerously close to the perspective of oppressors. And while it can be important, it is important to identify these things and to talk back to power by calling attention to injustice and demanding change, this mode of speaking directs energy towards those who oppress. As such, it can remain locked in what Gloria Anzaldúa called a counterstance, where reaction is limited by and dependent on what it is reacting against. And this, Anzaldúa noted, quote, is not a way of life, end quote. For example, the counterstance can get caught in what Nora Berenstain calls epistemic exploitation, an unending task of having to point out harms and provide endless justifications for identifying those harms as in fact harms, which can leave little energy for much else. What happens instead when we ask the question, how ought I to cultivate an epistemic life from the perspective of the oppressed? This question is immediately complicated by the fact that there is no unified, homogeneous position of the oppressed, that there are multiple axes of oppression that position those who are oppressed in very different situations in relation to one another, and position some as oppressor or privileged with respect to some axes, while oppressed with respect to others. However, these differences in how reality presses upon diversely oppressed knowers are primarily a problem, I think, if we are seeking one universal picture to organize reality. If we abandon this project and instead ask the question, what are some possibilities for cultivating a good epistemic life from various and particular situations of oppression? Differences need not be, or I hope they need not be, an obstacle, and can potentially, as Audre Lorde argued, be a source of strength. Asking the question initiates a number of shifts, I'm going to argue, in how we approach epistemic injustice. One of those shifts is a shift from epistemic injustice to epistemic oppression. The second shift is a shift in emphasis on knowing as justified true belief to a wide variety of epistemic activities. And finally, a shift away from the search for one model or exemplar of epistemic life, the virtuous knower, to generating changing possibilities for epistemic living, or what in activist circles are sometimes people call possibility models instead of role models. Okay, so in working through these shifts, I make use of two terms that I'm just going to throw up here for you. One is a sense of epistemic agency that borrows from disability studies, where an epistemic subject's ability to engage in various activities, epistemic activities, is a relation between knowers and their environments. And I begin to develop a model of epistemic life that focuses on knowers' responsiveness to what I'm calling epistemic pressures, where epistemic pressure refers to how the world and our collective resources for responding to the world press upon knowers, soliciting them to respond. With regard to the first shift from injustice to oppression, when asking about how to live well in the face of epistemic injustice, an initial question arises. For whom is the problem of epistemic injustice a problem that presses upon the ability to engage in a full epistemic life? And is injustice the best word to describe this problem? If epistemic wrongs impact epistemic life enough to make it an issue in considering how to live, they are a systematic issue That is, they are a regular occurrence that is structurally embedded in the world that presses upon epistemic agents. For this reason, I think injustice misses the regularity of the set of problems to be navigated, insofar as it suggests an ordinary or normal situation of justice that from time to time is breached by injustices. This background within which to think about epistemic violence and harm, I think, assumes again the situation of the privileged, one where epistemic systems, for the most part, are organized around supporting their epistemic needs, but may be misused or misaligned in some respects, thus in need of adjustment and fine-tuning. In contrast, to understand the violence and harm of systematic and historical imbalances of power requires paying attention to the establishment and maintenance of those power imbalances as the normal state of affairs. The term oppression more properly calls forth the context within which to ask the question, what are the possibilities for living in the face of systematic epistemic violence and harm? In thinking through epistemic oppression, I am working with an understanding of oppression developed by Iris Marion Young and Marilyn Frye. For both Young and Frye, oppression is a structural concept that situates groups in relation of privilege and oppression with respect to one another. Oppression, Iris Young writes, quote, is structural rather than the result of a few people's choices or policies. Its causes are embedded in unquestioned norms, habits, and symbols, in the assumptions underlying institutional rules and the collective consequences of following those rules. Oppression refers to the vast and deep injustices some groups suffer as a consequence of often unconscious assumptions and reactions of well-meaning people in ordinary interactions, media and cultural stereotypes, and structural features of bureaucratic hierarchies and market mechanisms. In short, the normal processes of everyday life, end quote. It's particularly important to keep in mind that oppression is structural insofar as individual acts do not constitute oppression on their own, but rather actions in relation to one another and in relation to historically resilient institutions and practices. Attention to individual actions as individual is one way of ignoring the structural, and hence of ignoring oppression. And I do think Frye's image of the birdcage is just like really such a helpful reminder for this, where each individual wire on its own is not enough to restrict movement. So if you're just asking about the one thing, it can seem confusing. Why is this such a big deal? Whereas all the wires in relation provide a formidable constraint on movement. And this is a helpful reminder that oppression is more clearly recognized on a macro level and more easily ignored or dismissed when looking at discrete individual instances. So, taking the notion of oppression to the epistemic realm, I am working with Christy Dotson's model of epistemic oppression that considers how systems that coordinate epistemic life can place unjust infringements on our agency, particularly when we're excluded from them, right? And that's where, particular knowers are excluded from practices of giving and receiving testimony or practices of meaning making. And I agree that exclusions contribute to epistemic oppression. However, in my own work, I have also argued that certain forms of inclusion, namely exploitative inclusions, through which one's epistemic labor is coercively extracted, constitute or contribute to epistemic oppression as well. Since knowers are interdependent with one another, establishing one set of epistemic systems as uniquely suited to represent reality is a way of maintaining hegemonic power and facilitating the exploitation of the disempowered. So there's, actually, I'm not having this on here, but hopefully I'll just say one of the other things that I'm getting from Dodson is the importance of developing and thinking about open systems rather than closed. So considering what it would mean to exercise epistemic agency in efforts to be responsive to the world and to one another, despite systematic attempts to thwart, extract, and exploit one's epistemic labor, gives rise to the need for a second shift. While epistemology is typically associated with knowing to the exclusion of all other epistemic activities, like this kind of standard justified true belief, and there's a lot to get from this model. We have many hundreds of years of thinking about it. I specifically situate epistemic agency in relation to a myriad of inexhaustible activities that comprise epistemic life. So epistemic agency is the ability to engage in epistemic projects such as investigating, noticing, identifying, calling attention to, knowing, ignoring, and also understanding. The emphasis on knowing as that activity that represents like the one most important aspect of our epistemic lives, I think is perhaps the ultimate project in what T. Nguyen calls value capture, the reduction of complexity to one or one set of values for the purpose of large-scale circulation and control. In addressing the question of how to live under epistemic oppression, I find that I need a different methodology. So I will not provide and justify an ideal picture of the knower successfully producing justified beliefs. Instead, I look at particular agents who have engaged in generative knowledge production despite facing conditions of epistemic oppression. I do so in order to shift attention away from the practice of analyzing justified true beliefs and toward the practice of describing epistemic life in ways that I hope are practically useful for resisting and living under conditions of oppression. Here I follow Christy Dodson in questioning philosophy's culture of justification, since it strikes me, especially in the case of epistemology, that directing cognitive labor toward the project of establishing universal norms for justification is a project engaged in maintaining power. So the methodology I attempt to develop instead is one among many possible methodologies guided by an anti-oppression or resistant praxis. Following Moya Bailey, I look to women of color knowledge production and how these particular women of color tend to the knowledges that they create as possibility models. Not standards for defining how one ought to know, but as providing possibilities for generating an understanding of what epistemic life can be despite epistemic oppression. Moreover, I gather these possibility models together in the hope of imagining, contributing to, and responsively maintaining epistemic spaces within which to live in despite of and in resistance to epistemic oppression. So in looking to and rereading, hopefully some familiar to you, feminists of color, I want to notice not just what each of the authors I'm going to mention says in their work about epistemic activity, but actually what they do in their writing, in their enactment of epistemic agency. I mean, I look at what they say as well, but I'm really very interested in like, you did this instead of that. I wonder, how should I think of that? So for example, in Black Feminist Thought, Patricia Hill Collins's version of standpoint theory stresses the importance of diverse responses to common challenges and dialogical practice in which similarly but differently situated Black women struggle with one another to achieve a dynamic and changing standpoint. And I think her emphasis on diverse responses and struggling amongst women who are not all situated in the same place gives us a very different picture of what's happening with standpoint theory than the one that people kind of commonly throw around, like, oh, you can only have it if you're in this one position. that doesn't fly with Collins. it has to be a group generated and struggled for standpoint. In her work, she seriously considers the dangers that occur when those who have been previously excluded are now included, asking what are the costs of inclusion? What are one's responsibilities to those members of one's community and communities who are not included? Does being included help or harm the people one may be leaving behind? And are there ways of not leaving them behind? Chandra Mohanty also attends to the dangers of being included, but in her book, Feminism Without Borders, she is concerned specifically about the way in which women in the Global South are coercively included as objects of knowledge within the scholarship by white feminists in the Global North, kind of positing as subjects of knowledge. As Mohanty demonstrates, knowledge projects that take the lives and interests of the Global North as their referent for organizing an understanding of lives within the Global South are colonizing projects, whether intended that way or not. So they're kind of doing this extractive move that Mohanty is worried about. Instead, she recommends a subject-subject relation for feminist knowledge production, as she details in the work of Maria Mize. Mohanty also has a concern with how and why certain ideas circulate more widely than others. For example, she wonders in Under Western Eyes Revisited, which is an essay, the last chapter of the book, reflecting upon the first essay, which was published as an article and kind of really got a lot of circulation when I was in grad school. So like maybe 10, 15 years later, she's like, that piece really got a lot of traction. But she wonders why it got traction in the way that it did, right? Why the more postmodern aligned critique of problems with knowledge production was more widely appreciated than the positive example of ethical knowledge production in the very same essay. Right, so much so that people suggested, and I remember hearing people discussing and debating the essay, that Mohanty was saying cross-cultural and transnational knowledge is impossible. When the essay they're saying says this has a clear example of successful cross-cultural understanding and transnational analysis. And it's really interesting to see Mohanty just kind of reflect on that, and in a very curious way, in a very philosophical, I wonder why that happened. We can also see in both Collins and Mohanty that their work changes over the years that they have been writing. I mean, Mohanty will go so far as to say, in a new situation, if the concept isn't working, drop it. I came up with it, drop it. When you develop a concept, just like, it's your baby. You don't want people to stop thinking about it. And she's just like, and as I've argued in previous work, considering Mohanty's Under Western Eyes in conjunction with Under Western Eyes Revisited reveals a relationship between Mohanty and her knowledge work that is epistemically responsive as opposed to defensive or possessive. She does not even say, well, what I intended must be what it says. She's like, well, here's where it traveled and what happened to it, and it itself, the article itself, has a life that she feels in some ways responsible for, even while not kind of possessing it. Or having a possessive relationship toward the article. Similarly, Maria Lugones is responsive to those with whom and to whom she is writing. One of the things I really do love in her work is that she will explicitly say things like, this chapter, this is written for this group of people, and not that one. Right? And she points out when feminists make moves in their writing that situate her as a woman of color reader in subordination to the text or the writer. She is conscious to acknowledge the thinkers who have developed tools that help her even when she's saying or pointing out how those tools might fall short in some way. There's often like a kind of thankfulness that someone came up with this idea that she's going to now kind of make a little bit more useful than she found it. Finally, Sarah Ahmed is attentive to a politics of citation that emphasizes the importance of those with whom we think, the knowledges we gather together to create spaces within which to imagine possibilities for living. Her attention to how bodies gather in ways that are oriented in the world highlights how these orientations place pressures on others. And one image that she uses in queer phenomenology that always sticks with me is, when everyone is walking in one direction on a very busy street or during the change of classes, right? When everybody's walking in one direction, you're trying to walk in the other direction, it can be really hard. And it's just all these people. It's not any one individual, but their orientation toward the world actually can place a kind of pressure that will either help you move along if you're going in the direction of everyone else, or make things difficult. So she thinks quite a bit about how body-minds move through the world, how some can and others cannot take up space, how the spaces we create direct attention to and in the world, and so have an epistemic realm, or epistemic aspect to them that I think is important. Thinking through and with the work of these particular women of color feminists, there are obviously multiple barriers to epistemic flourishing. But the way those barriers are understood differs from the way they are understood in the kind of contemporary mainstream literature. To highlight this difference, consider the double bind of epistemic exclusion versus epistemic inclusion. As Dotson points out, exclusion from epistemic systems constrains agency. Exclusion, however, is not simply remedied by inclusion. In other words, exclusion can happen on multiple levels, such that being included is not always the best solution, and at the very least, it is a complicated solution. As Patricia Hill Collins' work on the outsider within status of Black feminist sociologists explores, inclusion in dominant epistemic institutions can give rise to competing pressures, those of the institutions in which one is now included, and those of the world that presses upon you and the people you care about in ways that are not intelligible within the confines and strictures of the institutions within which you are now precariously included. Moreover, epistemic inclusion into systems designed from and in relation to dominant interests can be a means of simply exploiting epistemic labor against one's interests. As noted earlier, Nora Berenstein has highlighted the ways that calls to prove or explain things like racism and sexism can become double binds, where one either submits to exhausting and potentially never-ending work in the service of someone in a dominant position, or disengages from this labor, leaving one susceptible to the charge of being complicit in the notion that racism and sexism do not exist. This double bind is exploitative insofar as either way, one is epistemically coerced into supporting others' interests with very little hope of return or mutual interdependence. More broadly, I would say that when epistemic norms are unevenly applied, where one is expected to uphold norms that are not upheld for you, we have cases of epistemic exploitation. Finally, Sarah Ahmed has documented the way in which universities exploit the labor of diversity workers to ignore institutional problems with racism and sexism. So specifically, she notes that, and has documented at particular universities where diversity workers are set with the task of collecting data and documenting the inequities and harms faced by marginalized populations, so that universities can claim that they are working on diversity and so no longer have the problems being documented because something's being done. They're being collected and documented. And that makes me think again of the hamster in the wheel. Like, we have to keep documenting. Oh, look, but we're doing something. I won't say anything about my institution. Okay. I mean, it's just like when they come out with something that says, like, we're hitting all the marks. And I'm like, what world are you in that you think we're hitting all the marks? Okay. So, the double bind of exclusion-inclusion suggests particular dilemmas, a set of dilemmas to those developing an epistemic life under oppression. So some quandaries that arise. The first we might name calling or bringing attention without giving attention. That is, in directing one's epistemic energy toward calling attention to injustice and to oppression, one can become caught up in giving one's energy, time, and attention to those with power. Yet it still needs to be done. So, like, how do you bring the attention without, like, giving all of your attention? Are there ways of calling attention without simultaneously giving your attention to those with power? A second dilemma or double bind we might call, or uncalling, the difficulty of maintaining sense integrity. On the one hand, intersubjectively held concepts call attention to particular realities. So producing and sharing concepts for things that matter is an important activity. On the other hand, the circulation of concepts can lead to the disintegration of their sense. In another paper, I kind of elaborate on this dilemma because I do think that part of sense-making and language is that it's living. Like, if a term is not in circulation, then it's not in circulation in a community, it's not doing the work it should be doing. But then if you are circulating it, it can be subject to what I'm calling sense disintegration. What that is, Patricia Hill Collins, Tempest Henning, and other Black feminists, for example, have called attention to the way in which the term intersectionality has been somewhat depoliticized and lost some of its meaning as it has circulated within the academy and outside of it. And even in ways that turn the term like against what it's meant to, those who it was meant to help. So Tempest Henning has a really powerful essay on how, detailing some examples where the term intersectionality is weaponized against Black women specifically. Examples of sense disintegration, it seems, abound, right? Identity politics, affirmative action, feminism, now critical race theory. There's, when these terms circulate, oftentimes their sense gets pulled away from them. So the dilemma here is how to maintain the sense of conceptual tools as they gain wider circulation. And then the last kind of quandary or double bind that I'm thinking about is what I'm calling the difficulty of reaching for the right tools. So I'm certainly thinking of Audre Lorde's charge that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. But I owe my thinking on this to my co-editor, Janine Weeks-Schroer, who put it to me this way. When a person feels backed into a corner, they will reach for the strongest tool they have, right? And for those people who are simultaneously oppressed, so that they do get backed into double binds, and privileged, will reach for when they reach for their strongest tool, it's probably going to be something they have on account of being privileged. And an example, so that the master's tools problem is not, it's huge, all right? Because it's like, you've got that, but whoa, why am I using that? Now it's hurting someone else. So an example of this about which I've been thinking recently is when ableist terms, and Nancy's heard me go on about this many times, are used within literature on and within the discussions of epistemology of ignorance. So you get things like blind, deaf, idiot, to describe the ways in which dominantly situated people are unaware of parts of the world. And these terms, and I'm going to say in particular idiot, have heft, which is why people reach for them, but their force is drawn from oppressive ableist systems. So in light of these problems, I'm going to end with a few tools that I think are helpful for addressing some of the problems I've listed here. From Maria Lugones, I borrow the distinction between horizontal and vertical attention, so just like looking here instead of looking up all the time. Lugones uses this distinction to describe and recommend what she calls horizontal practices, as practices that resist, quote, two related injunctions: the injunction for the oppressed to have our gazes fixed on the oppressor, and the concomitant injunction not to look to and not to connect with each other, end quote. Because I'm interested in the epistemic, the kind of practices I consider with this distinction are practices of attention. By vertical attention, I mean the practice of directing one's energies toward and with those, and epistemic energies in particular, toward and with those who are dominantly situated. By horizontal attention, I mean the practice of directing one's epistemic energy toward and with other non-dominantly situated subjects. So the distinction between horizontal and vertical attention enables me and reminds me to ask, where and how am I directing my epistemic energy and attention? Following Lorraine Code, I try to think, and also Sarah Ahmed, I try to think about epistemic environments or ecosystems that enable agencies. In addition to Code's work, Ahmed's work helpfully reminds me that environments are created in ways that allow some gatherings and not others. Her work also reminds me that gathering with others is a way of surviving. The idea of epistemic gathering, as I am trying to develop it, has at least two senses. First, epistemic gathering is an embodied gathering of epistemic subjects who are differently, non-dominantly situated in relation to one another. As such, it rejects the traditional notion that knowers are or ought to be interchangeable. Instead, knowers are precisely because they are not interchangeable. Second, epistemic gathering is a gathering together of meaning. This sort of gathering aims to sustain resistant sense so that it might echo, in Jose Medina's sense, to and among other resistant selves, in spite of systems of dominance and oppression. So concretely, these concepts help me to keep in mind the question, how am I enabled or disabled by the epistemic environment around me? How do my own actions and inquiries contribute to an epistemic environment within which certain others are enabled or disabled in their epistemic projects and experiencing of the world? Who is and who is not gathered here? Taking these concepts together generates a possibility for addressing the bringing attention without giving attention problem or bind. One way to navigate this bind is by gathering in ways that create and foster epistemic environments through horizontal attention, so that it is harder for those with power and privilege to ignore injustice, but the energy is horizontally directed, not vertically. So in the horizontal, that kind of creates maybe what Sally Hassinger would say, ontic heft. In such cases, horizontal attention acts not only as a method of epistemic repair, but also as a method of resistance that escapes exploitation by refusing vertical directedness. This work then requires epistemic collaborators, or people to whom I make some sense, even if not entirely. When epistemic pressures act coercively to pull me away from the things I want to get clear on, Collaborators help sustain me in my pursuits. They are also people to whom I want to continue to make sense, such that I spend time thinking about things they care about, things they write about, and questions they ask. They are people whose thoughts I try to follow because they seem to be dwelling in the same epistemic neighborhoods as I am, but perhaps coming to them from different directions. They are certainly people who can help me be mindful, and I put this in here for you, Matt, of the spot about which Virginia Woolf wrote, that is the size of a shilling at the back of the head, which one can never see for oneself. Finally, they are people to whom I want to be accountable and whom I hope will keep me accountable as I develop particular lines of thought. One possible picture of epistemic flourishing, then, that begins to emerge from these reminders is the following. We might say epistemic flourishing is the ability to move cooperatively, not coercively, with other epistemic agents in ways that are responsive to the various epistemic pressures arising from my, their, and our places in the world. Such a notion is simultaneously individual and interdependent. It allows for the possibility of flourishing under oppression while still acknowledging the oppressiveness of oppression. And I think that's one of the things that's difficult to describe, that things are really bad and we have to flourish somehow or find ways of having joy and agency. Finally, it helps keep near to mind some of the quandaries and double binds that can arise for knowers who are working under epistemic oppression, while moving toward creative possibilities for living despite and in resistance to oppression.
So Gail has asked that I field questions, so yeah, just
Thank you so much. That was really awesome and gave me a lot to think about. So there's kind of two questions that I have. The first one is connected to the sort of notion of epistemic flourishing that you developed right at the end. And so what I'm wondering is if we might say that the projects, the examples of projects that you gave are actually sort of, we could say, resistant knowledge projects, and so therefore that's a sort of manifestation or expression of epistemic flourishing. So that's kind of the first question. But then the second question is more rooted in one of the authors that you referenced. So thinking of Patricia Hill Collins, one of the things that she talks a good bit about in intersectionality as critical social theory is the importance of dialogical engagement across sort of differing dynamics of power.
Yes.
So I'm like wondering how that might actually work within this context, because we're talking about perhaps sort of horizontal communities, but simultaneously, how do we sort of navigate directing attention sort of across dynamics of power?
So I'm going to say, all right, so I think I'm going to just start with Patricia Hill Collins, and then maybe I'll ask you to remind me, because I know you asked about that. So I do think that one thing that is important to keep in mind, that the horizontal isn't, it's still got power dynamics. And I think that, I mean, part of what I'm thinking is that, and same with Lugones, right? Lugones says, even in these liminal spaces where we're like creating things, there's powers, you don't ever escape power, and there's power and potential problems between differently, non-dominantly situated people. And I'm going to say, I think that is more of what Collins is saying. I would have to double check and go back if you want to be like, but right here, right? She says, you know, you do have to like, I do think here's a kind of dilemma but I think it's still about calling attention without giving attention. I feel like if I'm in a position to, all right, this is gonna be sticky and messy, to shield someone from something coming from above, then I feel like doing that is actually giving my attention not to the dominantly situated person, even while, and maybe that's like a double effect kind of a thing. Like I am, but I'm doing it because of maintaining a horizontal relationship. I mean, the thing that I would worry about there is I don't want to call on others to do it like for me, right? Because that's precisely the problem, or one of the problems that women like the Copenhagen River Collective were like really worried against. Like, why are people always calling on us to like help them? But I do think that's why the flourishing I'm trying to think of, and so maybe this will circle back around, is more about establishing new ways of being and living in the world amongst multiply non-dominantly situated persons, rather than putting attention toward moving through the systems that are already there. And I do think that, and then this is borrowing from Ahmed and Medina, that gives things traction in a way when you have like this, I always think of it like, forget about their party, let's have our party over here. And that leaves things open, like if folks want to leave dominant systems and come like help build something else. So it's not necessarily excluding anyone, but it's also not trying to convince people who are well served by systems of oppression to stop utilizing them. Yeah.
So I don't know if this gets, so one of the things that we just did out of the Fit Center is we just funded 10 Black women to be doulas.
Yeah.
And we have this health equity activation think tank. The primary members of it already are women who are doulas. We're focused on Black infant maternal mortality. The primary members initially were doulas, women of color, lactation specialists, and then we're like, who else do we want to bring in? We're like, okay, let's bring in this OBGYN. But the foundation was we were gonna start with the initial core, and then figure out who we can bring in strategically, who would help move forward goals that were already identified. And then once we started moving that forward, we realized if we really wanted to impact Black infant maternal mortality, changing the way doctors think, and even changing the way other people in the medical field think is going to take way too much time. But if we can train more Black women to be doulas, who want to be doulas and fund them to do that, then that actually is a big impact right away.
Yeah.
And so we did that, and they're all now sort of gathering and working together, and it's really sort of a way of building a community of resistance, and they're doing it on their terms. In fact, one of the women said, there's ways in which they're going to gain economic mobility because Ohio now through Medicaid is funding doulas. So before women were getting paid, maybe $500 or $600 a birth. Now they're going to get paid $1,200 through Medicaid. So some of the women in the group are like, this is the first time I'm going to be sort of moving out of sort of low socioeconomic status into being pretty secure economically. And one said if she does the number of births that she's been doing now, she's actually going to be in a 6-digit income, which was never imaginable to her before.
Yeah.
So I think some of those things get like, what are the strategies where that bring together people together as epistemic resistance. And the funny thing is, in our next retreat, on our agenda of what we're talking about, is epistemic resistance and epistemic injustice, which is really, it's like a circular.
Yeah, well, because what I really like about there's a lot of things. Now I'm thinking like epistemic doulas, like what are they, But that, I mean, a doula is doing epistemic work, right? Is saying like, hey, no, this, what are you doing? Let me make sure that this, is in line with the
And it literally is epistemic
values.
resistance, because they're right, they have knowledge that's different than what doctors typically have.
Well, and they have a connection
And
to the birthing mother that the doctor might not have. And in fact, so this is, I'm thinking of T. Noon's work on value capture, that there's ways in which stripping out all the contextual knowledge allows like big bureaucracies to like do things, because you don't have to like have the contextual knowledge that you can't equate two different contexts. But the doula does have the contextual knowledge. So that's one thing that I just want to be like, yes. But the other thing that I really liked in what you said was that you started with the people who are, invested in contextual knowledge, invested in Black women's health, who are Black women. And then, maybe, I hadn't thought about this, but that is a good strategy. Be like, well, let's just get one person in the system and drop them in this community. It's almost like doing the reverse of what tokenizing minorities does. Because I think when you like hire the one token minority, you drop them in a big department, and it's like their voice can't do anything because it's already like the department culture or the institutional culture is already set up, and they just kind of have to like figure it out and go. But if you've got the doulas who are setting the tone for what the culture is, how we talk about women's bodies, how we think about birth, and then immerse a dominantly trained person into that, it's almost like an immersive language instruction.
It is, and that's sort of how he's described it.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
So I was interested in the idea of dialogue. You talk about dialogue, and I wonder whether there's a difference between dialogue and epistemic gathering, insofar as whose language are you talking in? I mean, when you think about, having a dialogue on the oppressor's terms, in the oppressor's terms,
Right.
then you're at a disadvantage, whereas creating your own language, as it were, I don't mean language, but set of terms, some language, then allows you to sort of enter into a dialogue with a difference.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm thinking, and this is why I felt like the dialogic in Hill Collins is so important, is that I do think sense making always happens dialogically. I mean, yes, I make sense to myself, hopefully, but when you're really, I mean, I think the time there is the experience of like just grabbing someone and saying, am I making sense? Like there's something of that is important that happens there. And I am thinking also, like, so when I say thinking about others who are also but differently, non-dominantly situated as navigating similar epistemic environments but from different directions. I think that dialogues amongst those travelers, I guess you could say, gives a richer sense of the environment. And one of the, this is just brand new actually, because I've just taught Alison Kaper's Feminist Queer Crip, and she talks about collective affinities, that coalitions happen where actually not only new knowledge but like even new identities emerge. like thinking about what kinds of affinities can we imagine. All right, and so this isn't actual dialogue. I'm like, in the back of my brain, I'm like, Gail, this isn't actual dialogue. But what kinds of affinities can we imagine between like Audre Lorde and the Cancer Journals, her poetry in the Cancer Journals, and Ashley X, the seriously disabled child whose parents and doctors gave her treatment to stop her from growing, right? Because in both cases, there's a world that doesn't want to see disability, but they're so very different. But there might be interesting affinities. One of the things also that that I think when I'm thinking about dialogue and the way in which Kafer is thinking about collective affinities, she reads Bernice Regan's piece on coalition work through a disability lens, because apparently and I have to go back and look at it now, she talks about, they were like high up in the mountains, I think, and Bernice Regan said, all right, before we begin, some of us can't breathe. And she's like, and I mean that literally, because the altitude is really high, and we're not used to being up so high here. And what does it mean to like read that piece about coalition, written by a woman of color, and then think about this like little thing that she puts in there that that like indicates disability in some ways, that there's affinities there too. So yeah, and I'm trying to think of also like even historically groups that have borrowed from like the Pink Panthers, borrowing from the Black Panthers.
Lavender Panthers.
Lavender, thank you. Lavender, yeah. Other questions?
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how you might handle cases where there's disagreement within a group about whether they're epistemically oppressed.
Yeah.
And I've been struggling with this in some of the epistemic injustice literature and psychiatry, where you have some members of a patient population who feel they are subject to epistemic injustice, and then others who disagree within that same patient population who disagree with that. So there's some internal debate going on.
Yeah. And I was going to say I'm right about to look at some of stuff on psychiatric disability and epistemic injustice, and there is disagreement within the community. But I feel like that disagreement is different than disagreement from outside of the community, such that the disagreement within the community can be generative, I hope. I mean, that doesn't mean that like there's failures. There aren't failures or breakdowns of communication. But in the same way that Collins talks about common challenges but differing responses, I would think that there's at least something that we know we're talking about, even though we're disagreeing about how to handle that or what that means exactly. Whereas there could be other disagreements where it's just like we're not even on the same page at all. Whereas I think that, I don't know, that's a very kind of, I feel like I've abstracted too much, but does that make some sense? Yeah. I think also what's very hard too is cases where a person would want to insist there's no injustice here, and it's happening to them. But I think that happens quite a bit, actually. But I think that one way of understanding it is how awful would it be to actually acknowledge that this is an injustice? Or at least that's where that would be my starting point, rather than just like, oh, you're just, duped by the whatever, the system. It's like, no, actually this is a way of continuing to thrive. Where I think they're wrong, but but I can see why that it's a way of thriving. Yeah.
Probably have time for one more, if there is anyone.
Thank you for that talk. I love the start where you talked about the methodology as starting not from speaking to oppressors, but rather among the oppressed. I think that's like a really excellent methodology to start with. But I can see where this idea, the horizontal model, would promote flourishing. You said something at the very end that I was curious about because I didn't quite, if you could elaborate. It was, how is it harder to ignore?
Ah, okay.
Because it seems to me that it might be very helpful for collectives, but how does it, in turn, make it harder to ignore? Because it might be cumulatively easier to ignore.
Nancy's helpfully given me an example. I mean, I just think that it's a lot easier for the OBGYN to ignore Black women's concerns if she's just talking to one Black woman, but you drop her in a group of 10 Black women doulas, and it's just going to be harder for her to say, like, I mean, and not harder to ignore in a way that's like, I want to ignore, you know, like, I think there's just something, it's like language immersion learning. So in a way, it's easier to learn than just with the one-to-one kind of. And I think also, I think also this is why things that I think of as horizontal, like, get shut down. I think I don't think that we're in the classroom brainwashing our students. I think that we're actually they're talking with each other, and so now we're not allowed to talk. At least I'm at a state school, so soon we won't be allowed to talk about gender. Or critical race theory, potentially. Like, guys, call Columbus. Or even just the kinds of things like the Black Panthers did with freedom schools, and just even like cookouts. Like, why are you shutting down a cookout? Like, it's doing something. And so it wasn't, so even if you're not even just dropping someone in, I do think groups of people flourishing are hard to ignore, or groups of people who are calling attention to some injustice amongst one another are harder to ignore than just one person pointing out.
Thanks.
Yeah. And I would say Jose Medina is talking a lot about this a lot too. So like his our work resonates a lot, and I'm always like, oh, everything published before I but his idea of echoing, I think, is super important. But I think I'm doing a little bit more with gathering. He's encouraging on that too. So.
Thanks, Lynn.